It was a lively afternoon at the city park, a space buzzing with the energy of countless lives intertwined. Children's laughter echoed as they raced each other, their giggles mixing with the hum of conversations from families spread across checkered picnic blankets. Near the basketball court, sneakers squeaked against the pavement, their rhythm adding a sense of vibrancy to the scene. The golden rays of the sun poured down, highlighting every movement, every smile, and every moment of life unfolding. It was a sanctuary for peace, but beneath this surface of serenity, a storm of injustice was brewing. Standing at the edge of the basketball court was Officer Thomas Walker, his towering figure impossible to ignore. With his broad shoulders and a demeanor as icy as his reputation, he surveyed the area like a hawk hunting its prey. His uniform, crisp and spotless, painted a stark contrast to the murmur of mistrust that surrounded him. Among the locals, his name carried weight, not of respect, but of fear and unease. Walker was known for wielding his authority like a weapon, targeting those who dared to exist in spaces he felt they didn't belong. His history of overstepping boundaries was whispered about in every corner of the community. Today, his eyes roamed restlessly, his suspicion palpable. Every group, every movement seemed to set him on edge, as if he were waiting for the smallest excuse to assert his power. The tension he carried felt like a spark waiting for fuel, and the peacefulness of the park suddenly felt fragile, as if it might shatter at any moment. Not far from the court, on a shaded picnic bench, sat Emily Thompson. In her mid-30s, Emily had a calm presence that drew people in without effort. Her dark sunglasses perched lightly on her nose as she sipped water, casually chatting with friends. What no one could see was the FBI badge tucked discreetly beneath her jacket, hidden from view. Emily believed in the power of her position, but rarely flaunted it. Her preference was to blend in, to observe, and to let her quiet confidence speak louder than any badge ever could. For Emily, the park was an escape, a place to recharge and connect with the everyday lives of those she was sworn to protect. She wasn't looking for trouble, and certainly not for a confrontation, but as fate would have it, trouble had a way of finding her. The first sign of discord came in the form of a young girl, Claire, no older than 12, who carried a tray of snacks as she wove through the groups of people. Her skin glowed in the sunlight, her small frame exuding a mix of energy and innocence. She was navigating the crowd with ease until the inevitable happened. Her foot caught on a stray branch, and she stumbled. The tray tilted, and a can of soda tumbled, rolling to a stop right at Officer Walker's feet. The sound of the can hitting the pavement was like a thunderclap in the quiet moment. Walker's head snapped toward the source, his cold eyes narrowing on the girl. His posture stiffened, and for a second, the entire park seemed to hold its breath. "Hey, watch it!" Walker's voice boomed, sharp and cutting, slicing through the murmurs of the crowd. Claire froze, her face pale as she bent down to pick up the can. "I am sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling as her hands shook. Her fear was evident, her wide eyes darting nervously toward the officer towering over her. Walker's temper flared. "Sorry doesn't cut it," he growled, his voice heavy with disdain. "You think you can just mess around here without consequences? Show me some ID." The words hit Claire like a physical blow. Her small hands fumbled with the tray, her body stiff and unsure. I don't have it on me," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Walker sneered, his expression dripping with contempt. "Figures. Reckless and irresponsible. You need to learn some respect." And then, without warning, he shoved her. The force sent Claire stumbling backward, her tray crashing to the ground as she fell. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and a sea of phones rose into the air, recording the scene. The peaceful park had erupted into a silent storm of disbelief and outrage. From her spot on the bench, Emily's relaxed demeanor evaporated. Her sharp instincts kicked in, and her eyes locked onto the scene. Every fiber of her being told her to stay out of it, to avoid drawing attention, but her sense of justice burned brighter than her caution. She rose, her movements deliberate, her face a mask of calm. As she approached the confrontation, the air seemed to shift, the tension amplifying with every step she took. "That's enough, officer." Emily's voice cut through the commotion, firm and steady, yet carrying an undeniable authority. Walker's head snapped toward her, his jaw tightening as his eyes scanned her. "This doesn't concern you," he spat, his words dripping with hostility. Emily's expression remained neutral, her calmness almost unnerving. "It does when you're manhandling a child," she said, her voice unwavering. "Let her go." The crowd watched, some shifting nervously, others whispering encouragement. The weight of Emily's presence was impossible to ignore, and even Walker seemed momentarily thrown off balance. But his anger quickly resurfaced, and he stepped toward her, his fists clenched. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" he hissed, his voice low and menacing. Emily didn't flinch. Her gaze locked onto his, unwavering and steady. "Do you?" she shot back, her words sharp and cutting through the tension like a blade. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd, their focus shifting entirely to this new confrontation. Walker's face contorted with rage, his jaw tightening as he struggled to regain control. The air felt electric, charged with the weight of what was about to unfold. And then, in a flash, Walker lunged. As Walker's fist swung toward her, the crowd collectively gasped, the tension snapping like a taut wire. Emily moved with precision and speed, sidestepping his attack in a single fluid motion. Before Walker could react, she grabbed his wrist, twisting it behind his back and bringing him to the ground with a forceful yet controlled movement. The sound of his bulk hitting the pavement echoed through the park, followed by a stunned silence. The crowd erupted, some clapping in awe of her skill, others shouting in disbelief. Phones were raised higher now, capturing every moment as Walker groaned, his pride bruised more than his body. Scrambling to his knees, his face flushed with fury, he reached for his radio, his voice shaking. "Backup needed," he barked, his tone laced with desperation. "Violent suspect assaulting an officer." Emily stood her ground, her posture defensive but calm, her gaze steady on Walker. "You brought this on yourself," she said firmly, her voice carrying a weight that made the crowd stir. Turning to the onlookers, she raised her voice. "Keep filming. This needs to be seen." The distant wail of sirens grew louder, and moments later, several police cars screeched to a halt near the park. Officers spilled out, their hands hovering near their weapons as they surveyed the chaotic scene. The crowd parted nervously, some retreating while others held their ground, determined to bear witness. Walker pointed at Emily, his expression smug, but with a flicker of unease in his eyes. "There she is," he shouted. "She assaulted me and resisted arrest." Emily raised her hands slowly, revealing her badge tucked beneath her jacket. Its gleam caught the sunlight, silencing the murmurs for a moment. "You all have eyes," she said, her voice steady but loud enough to be heard. "Look at the footage. It will tell you everything you need to know." The officers hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. The tension in the air was thick, the weight of the crowd's gaze pressing down on them. Some officers looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight as they assessed the situation. "Is she FBI?" one officer murmured under his breath, his words audible enough to spark a ripple of realization among the group. Walker's confidence faltered as the hesitation among his colleagues grew. His earlier aggression now seemed reckless, his authority slipping through his fingers like sand. He straightened his uniform, trying to regain composure. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his voice quieter now. "Just arrest her already." Two officers approached Emily cautiously, their body language tense but less aggressive than Walker's. She didn't resist as they moved to cuff her, her hands still raised high. "I'm not resisting," she said calmly, her tone measured. "Check the footage. Everything you need is right there." The crowd erupted into shouts, their voices a mix of outrage and support. Some chanted Emily's name, while others called for justice for Claire, who stood nearby clutching her phone tightly, still recording. Her small frame shook with emotion, but her determination was evident. As the officers led Emily away, Walker smirked, his expression smug but uneasy. The crowd's judgment bore down on him like a tidal wave, their disapproval loud and clear. His authority, once a shield, now felt like a glaring spotlight exposing his actions for what they truly were. Claire's trembling voice cut through the noise as she whispered to herself, "We'll make sure everyone sees this." Her grip on her phone tightened, the weight of what she had captured sinking in. Within minutes, the videos started spreading across social media, carried by the crowd who refused to stay silent. The hashtags #JusticeForClaire and #StandWithEmily began to trend, igniting a firestorm of conversation about police accountability and the abuse of power. Walker, standing alone now as the officers drove Emily away, felt the heat of the crowd's judgment like a physical weight. His once commanding presence now seemed diminished, his authority undermined by the undeniable power of the truth. The days following the incident in the park were a whirlwind of chaos and change. The video of Emily standing her ground, calmly yet powerfully confronting Officer Walker, quickly went viral. It spread like wildfire across social media, sparking debates, discussions, and outrage. Hashtags like #JusticeForClaire and #StandWithEmily dominated trending lists, while news outlets scrambled to cover the story, their broadcasts filled with footage of the confrontation. People from all walks of life, from every corner of the world, shared their thoughts, experiences, and solidarity with the young girl and the fearless woman who had stood up to a man in power. The conversation quickly shifted beyond the actions of one officer. It grew into something much larger, a conversation about systemic injustice, racial profiling, and the abuse of power by those who were supposed to protect and serve. The public demanded accountability, and protests erupted outside police precincts across the country. The community, once divided, now stood united in their call for change. For Claire, the experience was transformative. Before the incident, she had been a quiet, reserved young girl who preferred to stay in the background, unnoticed and unbothered. But now, after what had happened in the park, her life had taken a new turn. No longer content to remain silent, Claire found her voice. She joined local advocacy groups, focused on empowering youth and demanding systemic change in the way law enforcement treated people, especially minorities. Her role in the movement grew as she began speaking out, her once timid voice now a strong, unwavering force. Claire's involvement in the fight for justice became a beacon of hope for others who had felt invisible, forgotten, and oppressed. She found herself at the heart of something larger than herself, something that could create real change. Emily, too, was affected by the aftermath. While she hadn't expected the viral attention, the pressure of being thrust into the spotlight weighed heavily on her. She hadn't acted for fame or recognition, but for a deep sense of justice. Still, there was a lingering anger in her heart, the injustice that had been allowed to thrive unchecked, the man who represented a system of power and privilege that had long gone unchallenged. Despite the overwhelming support she received, Emily knew that the fight wasn't over. The viral videos, the protests, the discussions, all of it pointed to a deeper issue, a problem that couldn't be solved by one act of defiance. It wasn't just about exposing one man's wrongdoing. It was about questioning and confronting the system that allowed that wrongdoing to happen in the first place. Emily's commitment to justice was unwavering, but she knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. A few weeks later, Emily found herself in an unlikely place, a holding facility where Officer Walker had been stripped of his badge and his authority. The man who had once seemed so untouchable now sat in a small, sterile room, his once pristine uniform replaced by a jumpsuit. He looked smaller now, as if the weight of his actions had drained him of the arrogant confidence he had once carried so easily. When Emily entered the room, Walker's eyes narrowed immediately. He had clearly not forgotten her, nor forgiven her for what had transpired. "What do you want?" he muttered bitterly, his voice laced with resentment. Emily sat across from him, her posture straight and dignified, her gaze steady. "I wanted to tell you something," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You had a choice. You could have been better. You could have used your position to protect people, to uplift them, to make things right. Instead, you chose this." Walker's eyes flickered for a moment, something like regret passing over his features, but it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. He scoffed, shaking his head. "And what good did it do you, huh? You think this changes anything?" His voice was bitter, as though trying to convince himself that nothing had really changed. Emily stood up, her expression unflinching. "It already has," she said, her voice resolute. "And it's not about me. It's about the people who now know they're not alone. It's about you facing the consequences of your choices." She turned to leave, but before she walked out of the room, she gave him one last glance. Walker was left staring at the floor, a flicker of something, maybe regret, maybe fear, passing across his face. But Emily didn't look back. Outside, the sunlight was brighter than before, the air lighter. She felt a sense of clarity as she stepped into the world beyond the holding facility. Change was slow, but she could feel the ripple of transformation beneath the surface. Moments like these, small but significant, were the seeds of something larger. A few days later, Emily returned to the park. It was quieter now, but the atmosphere had shifted. The space she had once frequented as a place of solace now carried the weight of her actions. As she walked through the park, she noticed people nodding at her, some even smiling as they recognized her. Children pointed at her excitedly, their innocent eyes filled with admiration. Emily smiled back, feeling a warmth in her chest at the recognition. Then, from the distance, she heard a familiar voice call her name. Turning, she saw Claire running toward her, holding something in her hands. As Claire reached her, she handed Emily a small folded note. Emily unfolded it slowly, her fingers brushing the paper as her eyes scanned the words inside. The note was simple, but the words struck deep. "Because of you, I'm not afraid anymore." Emily's heart swelled with emotion as she looked up at Claire, who smiled back at her with pride in her eyes. The young girl, who had once trembled in fear, now stood strong, unafraid to speak her truth. Emily squeezed her hand gently, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. As Emily walked away from the park, the weight of the world seemed just a little bit lighter. The words from Claire lingered in her mind, a reminder of the impact one courageous act could have. Sometimes it only takes one voice, one moment, to ignite a ripple of change that could transform an entire community.